We come together today, we are reminded of recent events which have led to the Black Lives Matter movement. This movement has caused America to pause. It has caused America to stop and ponder and to reflect. And it also has caused America to question her values and her integrity. It has also caused us as individuals to think about what are our views when it comes to racial disparity. So today, we'd like to focus this session on an authentic and candid conversation on racial disparity in corporate America. We can give examples and we can tell stories about the inequities, but we want to focus on actions. Actions we can take as board members, actions we can take as leaders, and actions we can take as individuals. So let's get started. It is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panel. First, we have Rodney Atkins. Rod is the president of 3RAM Group and the chairman of the board of Avnet. He's on the board of directors for UPS, PayPal, and Grainger. Formerly, Rod was the senior vice president and a corporate officer at IBM. Next, we have Gregory Jones. Greg is the chief diversity, equity, and inclusion officer at KeyBank. He is on the board of the Thurgood Marshall College Fund and the advisory board of the Black Aerospace Professionals Organization. Greg is also a distinguished visiting professor at Johnson & Wales University. And we have Theo Killian. Theo is chairman of the board for Tailored Brands and also chairman at A Better Chance. He is on the board of directors at Claire's, and formerly, Theo was chief executive officer of Zales Corporation. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for your willingness to have this conversation on a topic which is often avoided. It is avoided because sometimes it brings discomfort, anxiety, and tension to the room, but it is a necessary conversation. And I'd like to start it by asking each of you to provide your perspective on racial disparity. And given that racial disparity is sometimes considered part of our efforts with diversity and inclusion, why does it now warrant special attention and more focus? I'd like to start with you, Greg.
Thank you, everyone, for inviting me here. Thank you, Angela. You know, it's been an issue for a long time. And when I think about sort of my early encounter with racial disparity, I think about something I started years ago, actually here in Chicago, looking at the legal system and how it dealt with race. And as I was doing that work, I was a young engineer in the corporate space, and I began to see some of the same things, the disparity in race on how people were treated in the legal system. But I started to see it and notice it in the corporate world as well. And when I think about it now, you know, it's always been a subset of the work that should have been done in diversity, equity, and inclusion for years. I mean, if you think about this work from many, many years ago, it started out with the considerations of race, but somehow we navigated away from it a little bit. And as we talked about diversity and inclusion at that time, it was much less on race. And even over the last 5 to 10 years, they talk more about inclusion as if the racial component had disappeared. And a big reason for it was we were uncomfortable with the conversation. And as I think about it early on when we were doing this work, some of the backlash around reverse discrimination and all those things that you heard, or quotas, pulled us away from the conversation. And so we've been brought full circle based on the fact that we had to sit still for a while, based on the COVID environment that we're in. And then all of these things transpired with the murder of George Floyd and others. And so the conversation is right at the forefront now. And unfortunately, we got here through these tragic events. But I do believe that we need to further the conversation because of those tragic events.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Theo?
Sure. Let me also thank NACD TriCities, who I think does a tremendous job of bringing complicated issues to the fore that all members of NACD should be taking on. So kudos to that group. Thank you, Angela, for taking this on, and certainly thank you to all of the folks who are attending today, who are showing a legitimate interest in being a part of the conversation, but more importantly, being a part of the solution to this issue. So when I think about racial disparity, I think about those two words and I uncouple them. So disparity is made up of a base word, which is parity, which means equal, disparity, which means not equal. And then when you put it in the context of racial disparity, it means that there are things that are going on that at the root are based on race that represent disparity in our society. And I think about it as being an issue that resides on four pillars. One is educational disparity. The second one, which Greg mentioned, is judicial disparity. The third is healthcare disparity. And the fourth is economic disparity. So just very briefly, if you think about economic disparity, 85% of the brain is developed by the time you're 3 years old. Being able to read in the first or second grade has a tremendous impact on your success in high school and thereafter. But if you live in a place where you don't have books, where you're food insecure, economically insecure, where your parents haven't been raised in a situation where books were a part of it, or where they read to you at night, then you have this tremendous disparity. If you think about the judicial system, we make up 13% of the US population and 38% of the population in prison. The interesting thing about these four pillars is they're all very much interconnected. 85% of juvenile offenders can't read. On average in the United States, it costs $35,000 to keep a person in prison. In Texas, it's $22,000. So for the price that you pay to keep a person in prison, with scholarship money, you could actually go to University of Texas. And yet we put money in the prison system. It's really interesting when you look at what's going on in California right now. Part of the huge issues with the fires is they don't have the prisoners to help them, that they paid $5.13 a day. So this is part of this issue of, disparity in our systems. Healthcare, I won't go into very deeply, only to say that if you think about COVID, Black people die 88 deaths per 1,000. White people die 40 deaths, per 100,000. And white people, it's 40 deaths per 100,000. And then when you think about unemployment, we're now sitting at 10.2% unemployment. In the white community, that's 9.2%. In the Black community, that's 14.6%. So all of these things reside together. They play off of each other, and they lead to this outcome, which is racial disparity. And I would be, it would be unfortunate if we don't also recognize, as Greg mentioned before, yet another person who's been shot down in the street, Jacob Blake, not so far from where Greg and I live in Chicago. He's up in Kenosha. And here we go again with another statistic and another name. And it all becomes part of this dialogue and part of this conversation.
Thank you. Rod.
So first of all, it's great being here. And just to echo some of the points made by my colleagues here, both Theo and Greg. Historically, this has been, as we sort of kick this off, a very difficult discussion. But I would also say that as we sort of look at what's unfolding in front of us, I do think we're at a new inflection where the comfort level is beginning to, I think, increase around what I think has been a historical challenge. And, I sort of look at this on a couple of dimensions. One dimension, I have this view that, everyone wants a better quality of life. And so what does that translate to? it translates to, everyone wants some affordable housing. We all want a good education. We all want quality health care. The other areas, we actually want access to jobs and a positive support system. And we certainly want safe communities. So when you look at that, you could say that applies to any citizen in the United States. As a matter of fact, you can argue that statement applies to any global citizen. When you look at it on the dimension of employees, what does every employee want? Well, every employee wants really a fair opportunity to compete. And that's the opportunity to compete across the entire life cycle, from when you're looking at hiring, when you're looking at how you develop as an employee, how you advance through the company. And of course, we all want to be rewarded and recognized for our services and for our contributions. So when I think about racial disparity, it is really a conversation around, how do we make opportunities in all of these areas favorable or at least on parity with others. So, those are some of my thoughts around racial disparity.
Great. And that's exactly what we'd like to get at today is, within corporate America, how do we achieve that parity? And how do you start that conversation? We're all board members. So do we start it at the board level? Do we have a conversation with the CEO? I'd like to poll the audience right now and ask our first question. And it is, have you had a boardroom conversation on racial disparity? We'll give you about 30 seconds to respond. Okay, so Becky, when you think we have all the responses, can we show the results? All right, so it sounds like, gosh, that's pretty good. We've got 32% says that they've been having conversations regularly. 27% says that conversations have started this year, but we have 16% that say that they have never had a conversation. All right, so let's start there. So let's help our audience. And Theo, I'd like to address this one to you. How do you start that boardroom conversation? What does it consist of? And why is it important to have? And tie it to economics.
Sure. I think I've been very fortunate on the boards where I serve that it's been a conversation that's been brought up by the CEOs. Now, as I sit on the board and they look at me, perhaps that's one of the stimulating reasons to bring up the conversation. But the fact of the matter is the conversation has been brought up by the CEO. There is an inquisitiveness about what happened, why it happened, and how people can be a part of the solution. And it has translated into an ongoing dialogue about what are some of the things that we can do inside of our businesses to be able to both measure and make this a part of an ongoing dialogue inside of the organization. So it hasn't been something that we've had to push for. It's been something that's happened organically after George Floyd, after the huge number of demonstrations that happened across America. It was an easy conversation to have. The tougher conversation is how do you then action that conversation? What are the things that you do to move from there? And I know we're going to get into some of those questions later, but just in terms of bringing up the conversation, it wasn't difficult at all. What's the motivation for doing it? I think part of the reason that one should think about doing this is by every calculation, according to the Census Bureau, we will be a minority-majority country in 2042. So the world is changing in ways that will be different, and thinking about how do you create the leadership ladders for people of all races and sexual orientation so that you can be a part of this modern America that's emerging, whether we want it to or not, becomes, I think, a business imperative.
All right, thank you. So Rodney, you're on several different boards in different industries. Does the conversation change based upon the industry? So is there a different conversation you have for, Avnet versus Grainger, for instance, because they're in different industries?
No, I don't think there's a material difference, between industries. And it turns out, similar to Theo, I've had the good fortune of being a member of boards that have been very comfortable about having these conversations. And I would say most of these conversations are rooted around, I'll say, talent management. So if I just think back in terms of the roles and responsibilities of a board member, most of these things felt pretty natural as part of those discussions. And I always remind folks, good directors and good boards, they have at least 5 major focus areas at least. They clearly have to focus on the long-term strategy of the company. The second area in terms of our responsibility is company performance and generating, favorable shareholder value. The third area is around ethics and compliance. The fourth critical area is around talent and succession planning. And then I would describe this 5th area as board leadership, because there is, we also have to be focused on, as a board, we should have the right, skill and vitality in terms of being, good directors for the enterprise. So those sort of last 2 categories for all of my boards, whether it's serving as chairman at Avnet or the discussions with UPS and PayPal and Grainger, they have been sort of natural discussions around, talent management and the need for a diverse, workforce, where we would source skills from all constituencies to make sure that we have the necessary capabilities to run the enterprise and generate shareholder value.
Okay, so it's around that talent pool. So Greg, you're Chief Diversity Officer, and I know you guys have been on the forefront of really having some stellar programs when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Can you tell us, how did you guys get started, and how do you keep racial disparity on the conversation, right, on the agenda in the boardroom?
Sure. Well, there's actually a long history at Key of this work being done for the last 15 to 20 years. And our prior CEO, before Chris Gorman came in place, Beth Money, was a big advocate of it. So in general, this starts from leadership. I don't care how passionate the employees are. If leadership is not there, then it just won't happen. And leadership at the board level is even more of a forcing function to really get this thing going. When I joined Key, and just to be clear to everyone, I've only been there for 4 months, but one of the reasons why I joined was there was a solid infrastructure, what I call a diversity, equity, and inclusion infrastructure in place. So a diversity council, a voice of the employee system that we have, as well as all of the BRGs and the affinity groups and so forth, which are fantastic in really getting things going and moving. When I think about the board level, though, it's based, I think about what Rodney just shared. When you're looking at talent, when you're looking at succession plans, you have to leverage and push that whole diversity angle on that. And if you're not having those conversations around why or why not, then you have to really begin to think about all those things that you're doing in the operation to change that dynamic. When I think about the programs that we have, there are these, and I'm sure everyone's familiar, or maybe a lot of people are familiar, with the various surveys that you use, whether it's Diversity Inc. or the McKinsey survey, to give you an indicator of where you're sitting in regards to this work. And those are some of the tools that you use to keep your programs fresh. Where are you falling short? Are you getting a little bit complacent in the talent side or the recruiting side, you're constantly pushing yourself to make sure that you're improving on these efforts on an annual basis. And you should be looking at that dynamic on a quarterly basis. And these things are reported out to the board on a fairly regular basis so that you get the feedback and you get the insights from the leadership at the board level and the CEO level. And that's being taken on by our newly put in place CEO, Chris Gorman. And he has made this a strategic priority. He has talked about this passionately and very seriously around the work that we're going to be doing. And so I would also say in all of this, you have these conversations at the board level, but you sure want to make sure operationally that it trickles down and it trickles through with the level of seriousness that the board talks about it. And that's one of the things that I think we've managed to do fairly well. It's absolutely critical that you do that.
Awesome. All right. So what I heard from you guys is that it starts with leadership. It has to be a strategic priority, and we have to consistently and continuously look at our talent and make sure that we have parity when it comes to our talent. So here's a question which was previously submitted by one of our attendees, and I am going to direct this one to Theo. Racial disparity seems to be backwards looking at transgressions which cannot be undone. So how do we redirect our focus, to look at things in the future and potential issues that we can control?
So I sit here as a minority's minority, the only person who doesn't have an engineering degree. I have an English and history degree. So asking me to ignore history is very difficult. There's a saying, a person without a history of themselves is like a tree without roots. And even when you asked the question earlier about why now, we as a country go through cycles. We went through a cycle in the 1860s with the Civil War, and then for the 12 years after the Civil War with Reconstruction. We went through a cycle in the 1960s with Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, and tremendous bloodshed being leveled in the streets. We're now in another cycle where some of those things are happening again. So history is important because what it teaches us is that these things can ebb and they can flow, and that if we are serious, this is a moment when, in appreciating history and as we look forward, we won't let it get off of the agenda, but we will continue to drive the agenda forward. I think that's first and foremost, is thinking about what happened in the past, what can we learn from the past, and then how do we build on that going forward. I think different from some of those movements in the past, which certainly had some majority support in both of those major movements, when I have looked at in the streets of Chicago, the multi-generational, multi-generational composition of the people who are marching and who are talking, it gives me tremendous hope that this is not a moment in time, but this is a movement in time, because the people who are sitting behind us are committed to it and making it go forward. So I think in terms of sustainability in the future, it's important to understand that if you believe that millennials and young people are an important part of your workforce, look out into the street, because they're there, and this is a very serious issue for them, which should hopefully continue to make it an important issue for all of us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. All right, so let's move now into the next segment where we talk about actions and accountability. Becky, we're ready for our next polling question. Do you feel your company is taking adequate steps to address racial disparity? Okay, let's see the results. Okay, so 47% say that the CEO has had a dialogue with the employees, but other than that, and some of them have issued a public statement. However, not many have examples of racially diverse boards and leadership. So let's talk about action. So we see then, and Rod, I'm going to start with you. We see that some companies have issued a public statement. Some of them had had conversations with their employees. This is not enough, but let's talk about what else can a company do besides just issuing a statement or having a conversation. What would be that next step?
Well, let me serve up a few examples in terms of how companies have responded to this challenge. It's called, I believe it's called the 2%. Yeah, it's called the 2% solution, and it's sort of a framework that was designed by Robert Smith, and I think most of my colleagues here on the phone know Robert. He is a very successful business leader, African-American business leader. And he has assembled a group of corporate leaders to help have a conversation with corporations across America. And that conversation is really focused on what has been identified as several critical areas is known to cause a pervasive disparity. And just to give you sort of a flavor of these areas is defining actions around how to eliminate the digital divide, defining very specific actions with corporations around things like safety and security, education, health and nutrition, corporate leadership, and wealth accumulation. And as a result of this, and by the way, the reason it's called the 2% solution, his thesis is if every corporation invests 2% of their net income into these types of issues, that over time, it would help eliminate some of the disparities that we see. And so to serve up a couple of examples and the response to this approach was a good example is Bank of America. Bank of America recently issued a $1 billion social equality bond, and it's really a first of a kind bond that will be focused on investments going into community development financial institutions, investments going into helping corporations build out their supplier diversity programs, and also investments going into the critical areas like housing, education, and healthcare. So that's a good example of a company standing tall and really putting money into the communities and also putting money into employee development. Another good example is with the MBA Foundation grant supporting the 2% initiative. And then finally on the digital divide, several companies, AT&T, Dell, Microsoft, and of course I'm proud of PayPal because PayPal announced a $530 million investment that will be spread it over employee development programs, programs in terms of investing in Black-owned businesses in various communities around the United States, and also programs focused on helping to improve financial literacy within underserved communities. So those are just some examples, and I would argue that's not enough, but the good news is we do have what I would call favorable movement, where corporations are beginning to really understand the challenge, and they are putting their resources behind supporting a number of initiatives that's being driven by, Black corporate leaders across America.
Okay, thank you. So Greg, I know that you guys have, done a lot of things right within the community as well. Can you share some of that with us?
Well, a lot of it is in alignment with what Rodney talked about. Obviously, through our foundation, we've been doing a lot of work in the community in general around housing and other things. And the most recent events really has us looking at social justice organizations and how we're supporting them, as well as a recent 2-for-1 match for our employees. Any organization that you want to support, including Black Lives Matter, we were there to support a match from a 2-for-1 perspective. The other thing, though, and I don't want to shortchange the conversations or even the statements that are made by the CEOs that are really been sensitive to what's going on, because that's a start. The challenge is, how do you begin to what I call operationalize this work, right? Everyone, and when I talk about the infrastructure for a key, the fact that we were set up this way allows us to maybe redirect or tweak a thing here or there so that we create an operating rhythm, just like we would do any other thing in the business, around making sure that we're getting movement made on talent, on bringing in new talent, on promotions, on what we're doing in the community. And so a regular rhythm on, not only looking at the spend that we have or the donations that we're making, but also looking at the impact that we have with these movements on a regular basis. So, and once again, it starts at the board level, but regular part of that operation with the senior leadership team and the diversity team, and making sure that we're getting the most out of this work that we're doing. So the conversations were a great start. The statements were a great start. We were like just everyone else out there making those statements, but we're trying to figure out the way to thoroughly operationalize this work.
Okay, so Theo, I'm going to give you an opportunity to address this one as well, if you have any additional comments to make.
First of all, I love it, and thank you, Rod and Greg. I'm taking notes as we go, because I think there's some good ideas that are coming up, so thank you very much. I think that there are a couple of things that are happening in the United States that give us the permission to be able to do this work. One is the whole framework of ESG. So environmental, social, and governmental. So sitting underneath social, we have permission as corporations to do work in our communities. We have permission to do this kind of work. So if your organization hasn't moved yet, if you think about it under a framework of ESG, then this fits very neatly in that bucket. The other thing that happened last August was 181 CEOs signed on to this proclamation at the Business Roundtable that said businesses are going to be more broadly responsible for stakeholders, which includes shareholders, employees, and communities that we serve. So there's this momentum now that is already happening organically in corporate America that this work can nest under. I think Greg's point about having tangible operational actions makes perfect sense, so that if you are, like many corporations are, putting in place D&I officers, thinking about where does it report, what kind of budget does it have, the idea of having, and I hadn't heard of the Diversity Inc. survey before, but I love that. I'll find out more about it. But having things that what gets measured gets done, having things that are measurable, whether it's your talent indicators, your promotional indicators, thinking about your employee attitude survey differently. Does the board go deep enough to find out, are there things nesting in there that are problematic from a diversity standpoint and that the board should be aware of? That's probably already in your organization. And then the last one would be your code of business conduct. What do you say about this issue in terms of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable? and adding something there, I think, is a really good first step to making some of the movement in the right direction.
Okay, that's a great point. So all of you have obviously gained your experience in the boardroom and as leaders. Can you give us some specific examples of actions that you've taken or that your company has taken to address racial disparity? I'll start with you, Greg, because you said Key has a history and they've been on this journey for a while. So can you share with us some of those practices?
Sure. The driving and pushing, and whether they call it in football the Rooney Rule, diverse slates of candidates for every job, or as much as you can. The reporting out of, in some cases, the selection of the candidates. If we couldn't get diversity, tell me why. Let's have the conversation. You may have made the right decision, but let's talk about this thing. The broadening the net in terms of looking at diverse candidates. Where are you going to look for talent? And then proactively actually looking at talent. Leveraging search firms to say who's out there, right? And beginning to build a relationship with the talent even before you need it. And these are people that you would probably, just like at the board level, will start to have conversations with, but probably bring them in maybe 6 months or a year later. Are you building relationships with talent in the marketplace? And do you know the talent in the marketplace for the various levels that you're going to need support and help in the future? And that's a practice that's been going on for a while. And then bringing our business leaders in these conversations on a regular basis. It's in front of them. This is important to everyone. And how do you get it down to the middle management level, which is quite often where the biggest challenges are in this space. So it's a constant conversation that we're not letting off on. And it's a constant set of practices on the recruiting and the talent side that you just can't let off on.
Okay, thank you. Rod, what about you? And you're on several different boards and you're chairman. So what actions are you guys taking?
Yeah, so let me use PayPal as an example, because I really think it is a leadership benchmark, and a lot of it is frankly centered around I'll call it leadership behavior. Specifically, Dan Schulman, who was the CEO of PayPal, he has made a personal investment in this area. And when you think about the fact that he will host all employee fireside chats on this topic, and he's had several of these chats with all PayPal employees around the world, really talking about the value proposition of PayPal being just a good corporate citizen. So he spends time in terms of sharing with the team how the various investments will be deployed and how we would measure for impact and results. So I just think that is a hallmark in terms of leadership. There are also some very specific actions in terms of doubling or just doubling down on our investments with various affinity groups within PayPal, because we've concluded that is a very great sort of development environment and support system for the employees. And we have very specific and targeted investments that go around various programs for the various affinity organizations. And also there has been increased engagement with various professional organizations that provide services for different constituencies. So if you think about organizations like NACD, the National Society of Black Engineers, or organizations like the ELC, the Executive Leadership Council, we sort of increased our engagement with these various organizations. The other thing, back to the boardroom, and both Theo and Greg said this well, but the view is you sort of have to, you should you should expect what you inspect. And in other words, if you're not measuring it, it's to some degree is really not real. And most of my boards have sort of adopted as part of the talent and succession planning process to look at key metrics like how we're doing with hiring, how we're doing in terms of representation at all levels in the organization, including the C-suite, and then how we're doing in terms of pay equity. And those are just some really simple high-level metrics that have been sort of integrated into how we look at the overall talent framework across the company. So those are some very specific and tangible examples in terms of what some of my boards have been doing in terms of how they are addressing this in very specific ways.
Angela, if you don't mind,
Sure.
I think this is really important because when I think about our chairman, what I'm really enjoying is the fact that he says, "I don't know what I don't know," and the depth of the conversations that he's having with senior African American professionals, but also other board members around this topic. And so I think it's really interesting, and I think it's really important that acknowledgement allows him to actually go deep in ways in which others probably wouldn't. And so the willingness to actually open up and have these dialogues with senior or other professionals, both inside the company on the board level, but also outside the company, to understand exactly what he's dealing with, I think it's a really, really big deal. And the conversations that he and I have as his inside expertise is leveraged further. Those conversations are leveraged to take it to a strategy level for us from an execution perspective. So those things are really important as well.
Okay, great. Theo.
Yeah, I would say from an example standpoint, my greatest successes have come when I've had more authority than influence. And specifically, early on in my career, I spent a bunch of time in human resources. And I made sure that we had diverse slates. I made sure that there was no initiative, there was nothing that was driving it except for the fact that I fundamentally understood that it was the right thing to do, and that by putting diverse slates in front of the hiring managers, I could influence an organization in a way that it hadn't been before. So one of the things I think, as people think this through and think about saying, you know what, my CEO isn't there, this person isn't there, from the place where you sit, you probably have some hiring authority. This idea of what Greg said, pushing your search firms to make sure that they have a diverse slate for you to look at of people who are talented, who come from different backgrounds and places than you do, is one. As a board chair, you have great opportunity to be able to influence what the board looks like. So I've had great success getting both women and people who are racially diverse on boards because you have a great deal of authority. When I was a CEO, I simply made sure that up and down the ranks, there were diverse people at every single level and in all of the leadership levels. So it never really became an issue because we were doing the work, and the work was being done sort of systemically. But as I said, I think that everyone from their position has the ability to influence what this looks like. If you are a person with a budget and who has the ability to hire suppliers, are you looking at a diverse supplier list? Are you thinking about that as a way of doing it? So I think everyone has an opportunity to be able to influence this work.
Okay, so all of you talked about targets. How do you feel about holding management and executives accountable to those targets? Should it be in their performance plans? I'll start with you, Rod.
Yeah, I think so. And this is back to a fundamental belief that I have that, diversity is really a central part of talent management. And I do think as leaders, we really should be focused on looking at, the broadest possible talent pool and bringing in the best possible skills across all constituencies. So I do believe that there should be some degree of focus to ensure that we have a workforce that is diverse and is consistent with, the various markets that the company serves. So yes, I do think metrics are a good idea. I also believe that these metrics should be tied to, let's just call it, focus, initiatives, and programs. And then through the outcomes from those initiatives and programs, you really should have metrics that should gauge your performance and the effectiveness, the execution effectiveness of those programs and initiatives. So, to me, all of this should be sort of well thought out and connected. And, it all starts with how you think about the structure of the company, your operating principles, and then how you build the talent pool to support, the execution needs and the delivery of the strategy on a long-term basis. So to me, talent is very integrated and central to, in my opinion, high performance enterprises in terms of how they perform.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, what about you, Greg? So, as Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer, do you believe that there should be something in the performance plans that make managers and executives accountable to the numbers, and there should be specific targets?
I do believe that there should be something in the performance. Exactly what it is, I'm not sure, but it should affect the impact in a positive way. It needs to be there in order to get the attention for the behaviors that we're looking for. There is work that I've done around inclusive leadership modeling. What is an effective leader in the organization? What does it look like? And what are the 3 to 8 competencies that they have? And you build that into the model and you actually expect them to perform to that inclusive leadership model. So if it's built into the system and the expectations are set appropriately in the right way, absolutely it should be a part of how they're judged on performance. That's the only, if you think about how long organizations have been doing diversity and inclusion, we are where we are and we're still challenged. And so that measure, that expectation is absolutely critical in order to bring about change.
Okay, so this is a question which has been pre-submitted by one of our attendees, Theo. The question is, how do you navigate between having diversity targets for board members and the duty required by shareholders to find the best qualified candidate and the requisite skills needed?
So what I'm going to assume is that what I heard isn't what I heard, which is that you cannot find talented people in those populations. And as we sit here today, and I listen to and look at the people who are on that panel, I have a very sensitive BS meter, and it's going off. So let me start there and assume positive intent. So if I assume positive intent, the issue is first, and I want to just bridge back a little bit to the last question. Do you measure? I think the first thing you need to do is just take a snapshot of where you are today. And if you have a holy cow moment, which a lot of organizations will, then I think it is proper to start thinking about how you move those numbers forward. I also think it is critically important to do what Greg's chair is doing, which is take an educational journey to understand that there's a lot that I don't know. Because if you put someone in the system and the system doesn't understand why that person is there, then the system will reject that person. So I think that having an educational background understanding why this work is part of the work is really important, and understanding there's a lot that a lot of us don't know. As I take notes here in this meeting, it really is an educational journey, number one. The idea of finding qualified people, particularly on boards, I don't think it's that hard. I do believe that if you are perhaps looking in populations that haven't been looked at before, you may find a different result. And I'll give you an example. I happen to believe that there are some really, really, really talented people in the human resources function. Those people have responsibility for talent. They have responsibility for compensation. Many of them have been the managers during the COVID crisis. They have part of the responsibility for ESG. So if you think about all the things that Rod talked about before, you tick off on a number of those different issues. But what it may mean is that you're bringing someone on who also you need to put the time and the effort into teaching them how to be a board member, which is why NACD helps with courses like the one that Jen talked about at the beginning of this session. So I think in some ways it's looking in places where people haven't looked. Greg and I, as Chicagoans, will remember the movie The Untouchables. And in The Untouchables, there is a scene where Sean Connery says to Kevin Costner, because the police force is rampant with issues, and what Sean Connery says is, if the barrel is rotten, you go to the tree. And they went to the police academy. And if you aren't finding the people that you look at, maybe you go into people who haven't stepped onto a board yet that may take a little bit more time as you bring them on. But I guarantee you there is not a dearth of incredibly talented people who can do this work.
Okay, so the next question is also one which has been previously submitted, and it's one of those uncomfortable ones. When actions are determined and being executed to address racial disparity, how do you prevent white males from perceiving that their individual career opportunities are being limited by those actions?
You know,
go ahead, Greg. We'll go ahead and start with you.
Sorry.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Greg.
There is several years ago, I did some work with an organization called White Men as Diversity Partners. And I don't know if you guys have heard of this or not, but it was born out of me looking at diversity work at that time in maybe 2009 or whenever. And why is it always falling short, or people don't completely take it all the way? And it came to me that one of the big elements that was missing were white men. And organizations quite often say diversity is important, and they're going to get all the African Americans and all the women and all the people from the LGBT community, put together PowerPoint charts and begin to present some of the work that should be done. And it dawned on me that white males were being told what to do. They weren't in the room when things were being developed. And so I started down this path of having discussions with white men about how they felt about this. And it was very interesting. And we pulled them into the work. And I had an organization I work with help me with this, but it was to understand white male culture as we were doing all of this other work. And it turned out to be really important in that it was clear to them, or was made clear to them, that we need you in this journey. Now, this whole idea about thinking that the work that we do in racial parity is going to take the place of some opportunity they may get speaks to the value proposition of having leaders that can lead any and everyone. If it turns out that you happen to be a white male, but you are comfortable leading African Americans or women or someone from the LGBT community, the value proposition is that it makes you that much better within the organization to lead anyone. So if you take these things on in the right way, in the right mindset, it benefits everybody. And so when I talk to my white brothers about this, the value proposition is that we all win. If in fact you engage in this thing in the right way, there's nothing to be afraid of. Take this walk with me kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. All right. Did you have any other comments to add to that, Theo?
No, I think it's well said. I think that you can't groan and moan about not being included when you're not including everyone in doing the work. So, you know, to say that we want inclusion and to not include people who are white males would be an absolute mistake. And there will be pushback, and there will be parts of that population who will recoil. But I think, again, that's where the education and the inclusion in helping to do the work comes in. I think that's well said, Greg.
Okay. So another previously submitted question, Rod, I'm going to pose this one to you. How can boards avoid the perception of tokenism when seeking racial diversity on the board? So in other words, let's say that we bring on a Black person onto the board and they're the first and only Black person on that board. How can we avoid them being viewed as a token?
I think it sort of goes back to the previous question that was asked. You know, I like to think about when you bring on a new director, that sort of qualification onboarding process is really grounded. It is really grounded around, you know, the skills, the needs, the experiences that we need to help make the board more effective. And I know most of the companies that's on this phone and the boards that you belong to, we all sort of publish what is called a board skills matrix, where we look at very specific skill and expertise areas in terms of what's required to allow the board to be most effective. And I think, you know, in the context of onboarding talent, it is critically important that there are, in my opinion, no shortcuts, because I do think there is a rich pool of talented, diverse candidates out there. And as a matter of fact, it reminds me of some of the initial focus when we were having these conversations about boards becoming more diverse, but that actually ended up being boards onboarding more women as opposed to other ethnic groups. And we've done a fantastic job when you think about when you sort of look back 2, 3, 4 years ago, and when you look forward today in terms of the number of, I mean, really qualified, great women that's on various boards around the United States here. And my view is the focus has to be focused on good, great, highly qualified, skilled candidates that fulfills a need on the board. And then I think if you do that through their engagement, through their performance on the board, you will start to eliminate some of these, quote, views in terms of tokenism. You know, it turns out that we're all unique. We all have various points of views. You're not going to completely eliminate that type of thinking and thought from everyone. But I think for the most part, you know, if things are focused on outcomes, output, performance-based, and you onboard the right skilled executives, this notion of tokenism, I think it gets eliminated over time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Understood and agreed. So now let's move into our last segment, which is around individual actions. I'd like to do our last polling question. So do you ever say to yourself, I want to help, but I don't know what to do? So if you could take a few seconds, please, to answer this one. All right. Becky, if we can have the results. All right. Okay. So the majority say that they're confident about some actions, but unsure about others. Okay. Not confident at all. So let's talk about that a little bit to close out this segment. So one of the other questions that we received, if I'm not a person of color, how do I start a dialogue with my fellow board members? Theo?
You know, I think it's a very direct conversation. There are so many things right now that are happening in this country that can begin the conversation, whether it's, you know, the young man who was shot in Kenosha recently, whether it's the ongoing long laundry list of people who've been part of this. It's a really easy conversation to say, did you see how did you react to it? And how should we think about how that impacts what we're thinking about as a board? So I don't see this being a complicated issue at all. I'm certainly not coming from that vantage point, but I think it's like most other things in the board room, you're put onto the board because you have skills that you bring, to Rod's point, that you are a person who is looking out for the best interest of shareholders. And this becomes a really big issue. So within the context of doing the right thing for shareholders, this is a conversation that should be really easy to bring up. And there's lots of opportunities, unfortunately, that we're being given to have this conversation.
Agreed. All right. So Rod, you talked about talent. And here's another question. What can we do as current board members to help qualified Black and Brown candidates land board seats?
So I think a number of things. Again, you can engage in partnerships with various existing professional organizations.
And could you mention those again? I know you mentioned those before.
Yeah, you know, so we have organizations like the ELC as an example.
The Executive Leadership Council, yes.
You know, for the technical fields, we have organizations like NASB. There's also an organization, called, I think it's the National MBA Association. So there are a number of professional organizations that can help in the sourcing process. There are also a number of search firms, and they are very good at finding top talent. You know, for various opportunities. And you know, one of the things, and pardon me, Angela, I want to sort of make a comment on that previous question. You know, this was a wonderful panel conversation to be here with my colleagues here, Theo and Greg. But what if in the future there's a similar panel conversation with, I would say, non-people of color on this topic? And the reason I'm on this point is because there are a number of our colleagues, not you know, people of color colleagues, who can sort of share their points of view and you know, how they were able to sort of understand the challenge and then convert that into action. And it just sort of reminds me of a number of you know, leaders that, you know, I think they really comprehend this, and I'm hoping that they will continue to serve as sort of industry benchmarks for the industry. You know, so you guys heard me fondly talk about PayPal and Dan Schulman. Not just Dan, you know, you can look at Brian Monahan for Bank of America when he put in this large fund. You can look at the work that John Donahoe is doing at Nike as an example. You can look at what the chairman, both the chairman, John David Thompson, and the CEO at Microsoft, Satya Nadella, they're doing in this area in terms of addressing these types of challenges and issues. So it would pretty much serve as really good if we can have, because it's always, we're sort of the inside expressing out. And it would be great to have colleagues that's more from the outside and taking a view in, and how they how they grasped and comprehended some of these challenges, and why they are doing some of the leadership things that they're doing across the industry.
That's a very valid point. We actually did invite a person, a white male, to join us, but unfortunately he was unavailable. So let's end this segment with you, Greg. What advice would you give to our white allies? You talk about, you know, your white brothers. What advice would you give to our white allies?
Don't be afraid to have the conversation. As a matter of fact, I would encourage them to engage someone, whether it's secretly. You know, I jokingly say, Angela, some of my best diversity work I've done has been over at Grey Goose and Tonic in the bar across the street from headquarters. Getting them to have the conversations about this work or about the possibilities of this work, and understanding what their fears are, and then finding someone to take the walk with them as we think about this. It is a lot of discussion. It's a lot of discovery, and you can't back away from it. As much as you may want it to be done and over, I've done my diversity thing, or I've done my parity thing, it doesn't end, because the reality is, and I think Theo mentioned this earlier, we're running down history in this country. It took us a long time to get here. And so I want my white colleagues to know that I think we can do this thing together.
Mm-hmm.
You just got to be willing to walk with me on this.
Awesome. All right. Thank you guys so much. Now we'd like to open it up for Q&A. And Jen, I know you have sent me a number of questions here that I can, some of them are extremely long, but let's see if I can get to the first one. And my question would be to Becky, is there a way that we can open it up such that a participant can ask a question directly?
I believe so. I can unmute that person if you would prefer. So you just tell me.
I would like to do that, because some of these questions are paragraphs. So
Sure.
I'd like to open it up such that the audience can ask their questions directly, please.
Okay, so it'd be individually done. So if you want to raise your hand if you had a question that you submitted, is that how you want to do that?
That would be great.
Okay, so if you submitted a question and you'd like to speak that question out loud, if you'll just raise your hand, I will allow you to speak. Let's see. I see, I don't know how to pronounce his name, so I'm going to allow Jishan Kazmi. I'm going to allow you to talk now to ask your question. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Oh, there we go. Okay, thank you very much. You can call me Z, by the way.
Okay.
So very inspiring session. The question really was, you know, when I've been on various board leadership meetings and I've studied the risk of what has happened, there is a theme across, let's say you take 10 big incidents that have happened, and that theme just points to just a level of moral issues and ethics radar that is missing. And so what I have driven through that is just a general sense of values that we hold true to be able to see the disparity and all these things are humility, empathy, and being able to see yourself and others. And so the specific question is, we seem to be skirting constantly these discussions in nom and gov committees and other board meetings. And so my thinking is, and I'm asking that question, is has skirting these decisions and having evaluation based on values-based leadership really metastasized now into this, where we have material weaknesses and issues happening, immoral character stuff, and then on top of that, obviously, folks just make statements like, well, there's not enough qualified candidates, and they pass them on as true. And so from a board perspective in a corporate environment, would it take actually a much more enhanced view of values-based evaluation of CEOs and board of directors, and then enforcement of the tone at the top to actually fix this, rather than having general conversations.
Okay, so Theo, I'm going to ask you to take a crack at that first.
Okay. Yeah, I think that we have the framework, Z, to do the work. As I said, whether it's Business Roundtable or ESG, and you're absolutely right, this idea of values-based leadership, most companies have a set of values, and a good starting point is to go back and take a look at that, to dust it off if it isn't something that's obviously being lived throughout the organization, and to use that as sort of base camp for this conversation that's a much more kind of broad one. Last week when Angela and I and some of the good folks from NACD were prepping for this, I referenced Isabel Wilkerson's latest book, which is Cast. And what she does is she talks about Black people in America as being very similar to the untouchables in India, the Dalits. And what was interesting about that is at the end of the book, which is a really tough read because she bears many of the issues that we've all been wrestling with here, is she talks about radical empathy, which I think, Z, is at the heart of what you're talking about. This idea that putting yourself into that person's condition and understanding what they are going through. Greg's conversation about walking with me, I think it's all part of the same framework. And I think it absolutely can nest under this idea of what are the values of the organization.
Thank you. That was a great response. Next question.
Okay, we've got, so we had a few that were submitted before, so I'm going to give Cliff Wright had written one. If Cliff, you want to ask your question, I'll go ahead and unmute or allow you to talk and unmute yourself. Maybe just give a few seconds. I do have some hands raised, so I could call on the next hand raise feature. Maybe Cliff is muted. Okay, so next question, David Rainey, I have your hand up. I'm going to allow you to talk if you'll just unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, good. I guess so. I'll make one comment in response to some of the earlier conversation, and then ask my question. The comment is in response to the conversation around diverse candidate slits, and just to say that yes, diverse candidate slits are a good thing, but they're even better if you combine them with a diverse interview panel. And then my question, I guess an observation I've made over many years is that, and it's on the gender side, I have more experience on the gender side than I do on the race side, but on the gender side, the observation would be that men tend to be promoted on potential and women tend to be promoted on track record. And so the question is would the panel agree that the same can be said for African Americans in the US?
I think we can all say yes to that one. We absolutely have to prove ourselves before we are given an opportunity, is my perspective.
There are, in both segments of the population, it is said equally that whether you're African American or whether you're a woman, you have to perform twice as hard, do twice as good, just to get sort of equal consideration. So that is certainly something that I think plays out through both gender and race.
There was an article written several years ago by David Thomas, who's now the president of Morehouse College. It's called Race Matters. It's a Harvard Business Review article. And I wouldn't be surprised if you guys have not seen it, but it speaks to exactly this and the career trajectories of African Americans in the corporate compared to their white counterparts. And it speaks to the time lag. And some of it is based on stretch assignments versus risk assignments and things of that nature. It's still a good read. It's a really relevant read even for now, even though it was written 20 years ago.
Okay, next question.
Okay, I have Mary Giat has her hand up. Mary, I'm going to allow you to talk and then you can unmute yourself.
Hi, this is Marie. Thank you guys for doing this. This is really fantastic. So I come from the executive search industry, and I've been in search for about 15 years. And I hear you loud and clear when you say, why aren't there more diversity candidates, whether it's by gender or race, in the positions, and somebody says we can't find them. My BS meter goes off on that too. But my question is, so when you're in search from the perspective that we're in, and we're going out looking for what we call the purple squirrel, and we're looking for the person that our client is looking for with the skills and the expertise and all the things that we're looking for, and we also want to ensure that we're including diversity candidates, not just in the short list, but in the whole list and on a regular basis. And we have access to positions that are in the C-suite and on boards. One, where do you think there may be issues with when you look for candidates, and most search firms build up an internal private database as well, and we generally are trying to proactively network with executives, and so we know of people to call on when we do have an opportunity. Is it okay to track things like race and gender and things like that in your database without somebody telling you that that's discriminatory to track it? Because it would sure make it a lot easier to find people quickly, because I certainly couldn't tell from any of your names or your degrees if you were of a diverse race, and sometimes it's hard to tell even gender by name. And the second thing is, where can we start? How can we do a better job of expanding our circle in finding organizations where we are networking and proactively meeting more and more people who are of, people of color and diverse? I'm pretty good to go on the women's side because I do a lot of work on that side, but really on the race diversity side, where can we do a better job of finding people at that executive level ready for C-suite and board positions?
Greg, I'm going to ask you to address this one.
Sure. I actually spent a part of my career doing executive search with a firm called Egon Zehnder. And I was the second African American they ever hired in the history of the firm. And I helped them develop their, I'm going to call it diversity practice. At that time, I was connected with an organization. I wasn't a member yet, but I was connected with an organization, and I think Rod mentioned it earlier, called the Executive Leadership Council. Mm-hmm. The ELC is a place where you can go and find an abundance of talent. And if nothing else, you can begin to network there, and they'll connect you really in a fast way to some very talented C-suite level and board ready individuals. In regards to the database and how you sort of qualify people in there, I think you may run into some legal issues, but there are other ways that you can know, and probably less so now than back then. But if you look at some of the affiliations that they have, like the ELC, or even the undergrad schools, or even the graduate schools they attended, you could probably know that I am African American by the fact that I attended Tuskegee University, at least back then. But that, as well as the alumni of NSBE, the National Society of Black Engineers, Inroads, these are all very rich places where you can find incredibly talented people that are C-suite ready or board ready right away. And so I would encourage you to proactively, from an executive search perspective, go and visit, whether it's chapters or some of their regular seminars, to begin to build the relationships to get access to the talent.
And just, can I add just one more group to Greg's list? You also get familiar with the the fraternal and sorority system as well, because those are also good indicators of the constituencies of some of these applicants belong to. There are 9 fraternal and sorority organizations. They call them the Divine Nine, and if you see one of those on the resume, that will also be an indicator. The other thing that I would encourage you to do is, since you know these faces on the phone from this call, we can also help, give you some input as you go through that process. And what I trust that NACD, part of this experience is for us to use each other as a resource. So we are more than happy to assist in, whether it's C-suite opportunities or board level opportunities. We will always have an opinion or a point of view or a candidate or some form of advice.
And let me, I'd be remiss if I didn't do a couple of shameless plugs. I am the chair of the board of A Better Chance. We've been around since 1963. What we do is we identify talented children of color who are economically challenged. And since 1963, we have graduates of 17,000 people who've come out of A Better Chance. You would know people like Tracy Chapman and Deval Patrick, and many of the people as Rod and Greg and I were talking, we're connected to all of those people in some way. So there's 17,000 people who've come through that program who are doing major things and who've already been pre-qualified from an education standpoint, from an experience standpoint, from a competition standpoint. So there's that group I would add in as well. And I will once again say that historically, kind of women and minorities have been pushed off into the human resources function. Don't overlook it based on the work that function is doing today. There's some really talented people in there. They will need the NACD courses and others to help bring them on board. But I know some people kind of right now who came out of finance who are doing HR swings, who would be spectacular board members and who meet all that criteria. And like Greg, I did a couple of tours of duty in search myself. So Marie, we feel you.
Okay, so we're at the end of our time now, and I'm sorry if we did not get an opportunity to answer all of your questions. However, as Rodney stated, we are available, we are here, and feel free to submit those questions to NACD and we'll make sure that we answer those for you. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our panelists. This was an awesome conversation, and you guys were thoughtful, you were insightful, and everything that you talked about was relevant for what we need to do today. I turn now to the audience, and I hope we have been able to equip you with actions. I hope that we've inspired you to take action, and I hope you will also incite action. And we recognize that this is a journey. It's going to take all of us collectively to get there, and we hope that you will begin that journey with us today. Thank you. Jen?
Thank you so much, Angela, and thank you, Theo, Greg, and Rodney. This was just an amazing conversation, and we're so grateful to be having it with you. In the chat window, we do have a link to the survey. So if you'll take a moment to click on that, we'll also send it in a post-program email, along with some resources from NACD that will help you further investigate this important topic. Your feedback is really important, so please be sure and share it with us. For those of you who are in the path of Laura, you're in our thoughts and prayers. Please be safe, and thank you so much for joining us. Yeah, and California with the fires. This is quite a time, certainly.
Thank you all. Been terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.